Students, you have been assigned at least portions of a variety of films coming up for the next section, section 3 of this course. I can't believe we're almost there. Bev, you working on your energy? Yeah. Okay, good. But one of them is Birth of a Nation. And if you have not seen Birth of a Nation before, consider this a very brief preparation. Birth of a Nation was first shown in 1915. The film that was a collaboration between D.W. Griffith, a very experienced short filmmaker until then, and Thomas Dixon, the author of The Klansman, among other novels, huge best-selling white supremacist epic novels. The film became an almost 4-hour extravaganza about the Civil War and Reconstruction, but ultimately about white supremacy and ultimately about the story of why, according to Griffith and his sources, which were Dixon and others, why Reconstruction had to be defeated, why the Ku Klux Klan was understandable, necessary, and glorious. It's a film that still can shock you. It's a silent film. It's often lauded for its cinematic originality, and it did have a great deal of that. Most of it was filmed in some desert settings up north of Los Angeles, in case you're wondering. But it stands as this stamp on time, a visual rendition of the popular version of the meaning and memory, especially of Reconstruction, but of the Civil War itself. I'll come back to that in next week's final lecture for my section about this struggle over memory. And I'll also come back next Tuesday to the West and the South, especially the dispossession, massive dispossession of Native American peoples, the origins of the reservation system, the Indian Wars, and then particularly the development of this thing called the Jim Crow South. I will get you to 1898 and hand that off as though it's almost the 20th century. But today I'm going to try to handle the Gilded Age, or the ends of Reconstruction, so to speak, and the Gilded Age. I have a little help here, and I'll employ Mark Twain again, not from Huck Finn this time. But when did Reconstruction end? Well, I gave you a lot of possible dates up there, including 2050. So students, when you're in the prime of life, the prime of your power and your wealth accumulation, please solve Reconstruction once and for all by 2050. Okay? And don't forget you were challenged to do that. Now, some Americans thought Reconstruction had well, you can pick your moment here. There are reasons for all of those dates. 1877 is kind of the official, the Compromise of 1877 supposedly ended Reconstruction. 1883 is the U.S. v. Stanley case, which was a 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court, effectively obliterating the 14th Amendment based on 5 the so-called civil rights cases brought to the court from various parts of the country about access for African Americans to basic public facilities. 1913 is another candidate. Soon you get the first Southern-born president of the United States inaugurated in Woodrow Wilson, and he brings a cabinet to Washington that will resegregate the federal government. there are those who will argue, have argued. Now, Reconstruction really pretty much ends then, but then there are a lot of other candidates, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if you like a 1960s example. Voting Rights Act seemed so permanent. Somebody over here is at least smiling. It seemed so permanent. It seemed a revolution. Not unlike the 15th Amendment was treated in 1870. Let us have peace, people said back then. Reconstruction's over. Some thought it was November 4 or November 5, 2008. What happened then? Yeah, it was the night of Barack Obama's victory in the election of 2008. And on the following morning, probably still a little tipsy from his cups, Tom Friedman in the New York Times wrote this topic sentence on his column entitled "Finishing Our Work." He said, "And so it came to pass that on November 4, 2008, shortly after 10 p.m. Eastern Time, the American Civil War ended. As a black man, Barack Hussein Obama won enough electoral votes to become president of the United States." He goes on then to cite Gettysburg and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and he just couldn't hold himself back. I used that line once in a Yale reunion lecture, and I paid the price. Tom was in the audience with his daughter. And I hope he doesn't have another granddaughter here today or something. You never know when you're speaking to a Yale audience who's out there. It was all over. Remember, as half the country was crying for one reason and the other half the country was crying for another reason? Reconstruction's not over, folks. It's had many endings. Now, in the 1870s, I'm going to come back to the panic briefly and that election of 74, and especially the election of 76 and its compromise, the so-called disputed election, which does, in effect, end the policy era of Reconstruction. But the country's already undergoing what could be simply called the Gilded Age's crisis of industrial capitalism. Mark Twain's famous novel, for which this era gets its name or took its name, Mark Twain has influence everywhere. His novel, The Gilded Age, he published in 1872, in the middle of Reconstruction, with Dudley Warner, his collaborator and neighbor. Back to that, at the end of the lecture, one of the most savage satires of American democracy anyone's ever imagined. So if you're looking for a satire, a savage satire of American democracy right now, pick up Twain's Gilded Age, folks. It will entertain you. Could make you lose your lunch, too, but, But between 1865 and 1873, just 8 years, from Appomattox to the beginning of the Panic of 1873, this economic depression that on and off is going to last the whole rest of the 19th century and get really worse in the 1890s. About 3 million new immigrants arrived in the United States. Immigration opened up widely again from Europe once the war ended. Post-war industrial production in these 8 years increased 75%. It's a boom. And of course, what happens in booms? Railroads were overbuilt. Speculation in Western lands was overdone. Speculation in certain kinds of other industries and manufacturing, overdone. For the first time, non-agricultural workers outnumbered farmers. And wage earners outnumbered independent craftsmen by 1873 across the American economy. What is that going to do with the Republicans? I mentioned this the other day. Key purpose, their key theme, their mantra, free labor. When a laborer becomes an employee who does not control, certainly doesn't control his wages, doesn't control his time, works on a clock for somebody else, becomes a cog with a task in a machine, is he a free laborer? Can he just take his labor somewhere else? Maybe, but not after 1873. By 73, only Britain's industrial output was greater than the United States, but not for long. U.S. government policies had fostered all of this. Low taxes, but only on investment. There was no income tax. There was an income tax during the American Civil War, and it got as high as 3 and 4%. Think of that when you go do your taxes next spring. Corporate taxes never got much higher than 8 to 10%. High tariffs, a key Republican issue, supporting the manufacturers, supporting business interests and bankers and merchants. Republicans tended to love tariffs. Democrats tended to hate them. Tariffs were a visceral political issue during the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. There was open support for railroad entrepreneurs. You want to build a railroad? Here's the subsidy. Here's another subsidy. Give me a kickback. Between 1865 and 73, 35,000 miles of new railroad track were laid, the total exceeding the entire mileage of 1860. Railroad building fueled the banking industry with loans and investment. And it made Wall Street the center of the American economy. There was Cornelius Vanderbilt sort of inventing Wall Street while he's building canals and railroads. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the biggest and most powerful railroad of its time until it wasn't, became the largest the Pennsylvania Railroad became the largest corporation of its time, although Vanderbilt's transportation empire came close to it, and J.D. Rockefeller is only a short bit behind here with Standard Oil, and Andrew Carnegie with U.S. Steel. There was a separation now happening between worker and ownership. Workers were becoming people without control. Laborers, increasingly, especially immigrants, were living in tenements, and not just the Lower East Side of New York City, in Philadelphia and a whole lot of other cities. Cincinnati had tenements. People would put on their census record, their occupation. It would read, common laborer, general jobber. A general jobber came to mean, I'll work for pay, anything. What do you got? And of course, the country's moving west. Oh, God, is it moving west? More on this next Tuesday. But across the West, the federal government in the 1870s pursued a policy of containment, sometimes it was called that, against Native Americans. Although in California, it became too often slaughter, or what white Californians came to call Indian hunting. They were in the way. By 1880, 30 years of such violence in the West had left an estimated 4,500 dead American Indians in California alone. In Texas, Mexicans and other mixed race, we'd call them Hispanics, were deemed culturally, stereotypically lazy, and subjected to all kinds of new discriminatory laws. A little more on that next time. And then the Chinese immigration into California brought about, of course, and I'll turn to this next week, brutal violence against Chinese workers, Chinese neighborhoods. They were brought here in part, or they came here in part to work on building railroads, but they established all kinds of businesses, as did Japanese. All kinds of businesses, their own schools, their own neighborhoods. Anti-coolie clubs, as they were called, appeared in California first in the 1870s. There were laws passed that fanned the flames of anti-Asian racism of all sorts. And by 1879, the California Constitution outright denied Chinese the right to vote. And the United States would have its first full-scale, well, there was an earlier one in 1874, a Chinese Exclusion Act just for women. They breed, you know. But the full National Chinese Exclusion Act would come from Congress in 1882. It wouldn't work over time, but it was done. The North-South axis of Reconstruction, which is where we tend to focus, and not without reason, was also an East-West phenomenon. Americans are moving west. Their memories are going with them. Their problems are going with them. Their assumptions are going with them. Their race relations issues are going with them all over the West. And if you're from the West or you visit the West, you'll find Civil War monuments, huge ones in the center of Denver or Portland or Los Angeles. And you wonder, why do they care so much about the Civil War? Well, that's in part because a lot of ex-Confederates moved there and a lot of ex-Union people moved there, and they started building competing memorials. That's what people always do. In the 1870s and 1880s, in law and in custom, Americans were undergoing a kind of tortured reconsideration, as we always are, I guess, of who they were. What was an American by the 1880s? Can there be a Chinese American with any kind of rights? The Black Americans, they have rights now under the Constitution, at least. What about Japanese Americans? What about Mexican Americans? What about all the varieties of Mexicans? What about Catholics? Woo, a lot of them are coming now. And you know what they do to phone booths? Sorry. Now, in the middle of the first year of the Panic of 1873, there's an off-year election. I may have just touched on this the other day, but not much. That election of 1874 is one of the most important midterm elections in all of American history. Democratic Party is really reviving, especially in the South. They've already taken back control of all but three, by 74, all but three of the ex-Confederate states have been redeemed. Democratic control, state houses, governorships. Reconstruction's enforcement has essentially gone belly up. The Grant administration is mired in a whole variety of scandals, although miraculously, none of them really completely touched Ulysses Grant personally, although he had a brother-in-law here and a cousin there that were more than touched. The scandal of Accredit Mobile, which blew up in about 1869, was all about the transcontinental railroads and how the land and the money was distributed. The whiskey ring is one of the classics. The excise taxes, of course, in fact, excise taxes are one of the primary sources of income for the federal government in these years. And classic excise tax is, of course, on whiskey. And distilleries all over the country, it started in St. Louis, but it spread city after city after city, got in on the take. It was run out of the Revenue Department of the federal government by a whole team of people. who set the prices. And the guys out running the St. Louis and the Cincinnati and the Detroit and the Louisville and the go on and on and on. Distilleries and excise tax collecting offices all over the country were all in on the take. And in the end, no one truly knows how many millions of dollars was stolen of whiskey money. It's a nice irony for the Gilded Age. There were other scandals. I'll leave it there. But that election of 74 has now a Republican Party no longer really run by the radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens is dead. Charles Sumner is going to die the very next year, in 1875. He no longer has the clout and sway he once did. The authors, John Bingham is gone. The authors of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments are essentially gone from Washington. And the Republican Party is already becoming this kind of party of business, party of investments, party of Wall Street, party of railroads. And they're happy to be. And in that campaign of 1874, the Democrats ran against corruption. They ran against three things: corruption, black people, and corruption. It just sort of was the bookends of everything. And they weren't always wrong. Oh, well, they ran a viciously white supremacist campaign. They ran a campaign against Reconstruction. The 1874 congressional elections was a referendum on Reconstruction. Is it over? You bet, said the Democrats. Put us in power and we'll make sure we'll run it into the gutter. And they will, or the best they can. The Republicans were smashed at the polls across the North, not least of which, of course, the South, but especially across the North. And the Democrats are going to come to Washington for the first time with a majority of Congress in both houses. The war's only 9 years ago. The Democrats were left ruined and sullied and almost desperate in 1865 to survive as a political party. They had run against Lincoln on a platform that would have sued for peace with the Confederacy. Now they're the party of national reconciliation. And the Republicans are that party of all this turmoil, all this economic strife, all the turmoil over race, all the problems in the South, all the death of your sons and so on in that war. Now, Republicans are fighting back. They're not saying, oh, yeah, you were right all along about your bloody shirt and we were wrong. No. But they get hammered at the poll. You've seen this in lots of elections. Tides change faster than we expect. So the backdrop then for 1876 is there's only 3 states left unredeemed, if you want. They are Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. All the other ex-Confederate states are back in the Union. Well, they're all back in the Union, but all of them are under the control of Democrats, except 3. And the hold that Republicans have on the governor's offices of Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida are tenuous. Tenuous in part because of the violence now of Reconstruction. Now, who do the Democrats run for president? Samuel Tilden. There he is. He looks like a perfectly decent guy. He was the governor of New York. He was a nervous, boyish type, an introvert who didn't particularly like politics. But he got himself into the governorship, and he liked to go after corruption. He had, as they said, bagged Boss Tweed. He had He had indicted and prosecuted Boss Tweed, who ran New York City politics, on charges of corruption. It's the centennial year of the United States. It's 1876, and Congress has allocated millions of dollars to hold a gigantic celebration in Washington, D.C. for about 4 months, the whole summer. There are about 36 or 37 million Americans. Maybe it was closer to 40 by then. But 1 of every 4 Americans made it to Philadelphia for that centennial celebration. And what they saw, among other things, was, well, let me jump ahead. What they saw is so many celebrations of machines. It was the birth of the machine age. This stuff was irresistible. You could see these giant steam engines. You could see factory machines that could now produce at rates heretofore unheard of. And at that centennial celebration, it was irresistible for Americans to want to feel a sense of reconciliation. It was a kind of a theme of it. Let's bring ourselves back together. Let's bring North and South back together. Well, black people were not there, except for working as the waiters at what was called the Southern Pavilion. They weren't represented for themselves or their culture or their mores or anything. You could go witness the 700-ton, 40-foot-high Corliss steam engine. And the only Native Americans who were there in headdresses to be sort of props. Machines were the stars. There was a women's pavilion, added as an afterthought. They were afraid of protests for women's suffrage. There were some. But it housed collections of needlework and weaving and demonstrations of power looms. It was women working looms. Well, women's work. There was a black man named Benjamin Montgomery who won the Cotton Production Prize at the National Centennial celebration. And he beat out cotton varieties and products from Brazil, Egypt, the Fiji Islands, and all across the South. His name was Benjamin Montgomery. His land was the former land of Jefferson Davis. Irony makes the world go round. American Indians showed up because of the telegraph, because of rapid news sources, because right on the eve of 4th of July, this grand celebration was interrupted when the news came that some real Indians out in a place called Little Bighorn, no one had ever heard of, had not only defeated but wiped out the Sioux, fighting with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, had wiped out General Custer and his cavalry, which of course would become, with a short time, a Pyrrhic victory for the Native Americans of the Great Plains and the Upper Plains. But this slaughter of Custer and his men was huge news, and it would lead in time to Custer being the favorite image above every saloon in America. I don't know what it is now, probably a NFL football logo or something. The country's trying to reconcile its reality under its feet, won't exactly allow it. Samuel Tilden, though, is the candidate for president of the Democrats. But for the Republicans, they're going to run Rutherford B. Hayes. Yeah, I mean, I love talking about Rutherford B. Hayes. He's fascinating for his paradoxes. Sometimes, as I had up on the outline, he was called his fraudulency, or somebody pronounced some of his opponents love to pronounce his, and even some Republicans like to pronounce his name, Rutherford Hayes. That's hard to say. Rutherford. It's pretty hard to actually say. He was from Ohio, which confirms that old adage. We've had a lot of Ohio presidents. Huh? You counted them? A lot of them. It only confirms that old adage that some are born great, some become great, and some are just from Ohio. I always get away with that. He was a Civil War veteran, decorated. He'd been about everything you can be in Ohio politics, including governor. He was a moderate. Republicans needed a moderate. He had a way of kind of speaking to audiences that could please one side or the other, depending on where you saw him speak. And he had a way of speaking, as a great politician can, where you'd walk out and think, he was impressive, but what did he say? He could, in one moment, preach state authority, and the next, federal authority. Hayes' vision of the meaning and extent of black freedom after the war was limited, but it went further than most white Northerners, at least by this point in time. He was more like Lincoln than Thaddeus Stevens, at least in his point of view. He was more Grant than he was Frederick Douglass. In 1867, in the governor's race in Ohio, he narrowly won while a black male suffrage amendment was defeated in Ohio. He, on the one hand, preached that he wanted to end federal enforcement in the South. We have to stop this now. We've done enough of this. And he would preach reconciliation. 1871, he said, the old sectional bitterness is dying out rapidly, never to revive. In 1871, Rutherford. By 75, Hayes was not fond of the new federal civil rights bill that was passed that year in 1875, which went further than the original one. He said, I, of course, don't believe in forcing whites and blacks together. And he announced what would be his motto, really, for the 1876 campaign. He said, the let alone policy seems now to be the true course, let alone, meaning they were going to have to let the South alone. Let the South do its own devices. Let it eventually have some kind of home rule. In the campaign of 1876, Hayes would say such things as, my policy is trust, peace, and to put aside the bayonet. Put the bayonets away. Let's have peace. I mean, who doesn't want that? When you remember the blood of only 10 years ago, and you've lost a son, a cousin, a father, a brother. Hayes campaigned in the Deep South. He had different speeches he gave there. He gave reunion speeches in the Deep South. He gave reconciliation addresses. He gave addresses about goodwill and harmony and American patriotism. In the North, he gave speeches about harmony and good patriotism. But we fought for the great cause. We fought to free the slaves. We are the party that saved the Union. So, you could fashion reconciliation. That's the beguiling problem with it. You could fashion reconciliation to fit whatever argument you wanted. God, he was good at it. People are weary of sectional controversy, he said. It will gradually drop out of sight. Let the rights of the colored people be secured and the laws enforced, and wait for the healing influences of time and reflection to solve and remove the remaining difficulty. Just give it time. Americans solve their problems. Well, this election was brutally close, brutally corrupt. And it ended up, of course, with 3 disputed states. I'll do this quite quickly, but I want you to see a map, though, while we're thinking on that. There it is. This is actually about the readmission to the Union, but at least you can see the map here. Now, this was a cliffhanger for this reason. When the votes started coming in by telegraph on the night of the election in the fall of 1876, it looked pretty bad for Republicans. And at one point, Hayes was told by his campaign managers, it's over, sir. In a few days, we'll know, but we just can't carry these southern states. But then others got hold of the story. We call it the narrative. And Lewis Cass, particularly of Michigan, said, hold off. Don't issue any statements. Don't let Hayes speak to any of the press. Keep Hayes quiet. Hayes, for 2 weeks, kept saying to everybody, I know I lost. Why don't you let me go say it? No, sir. We're going to win this. Well, there were 3 disputed states: Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Tilden carried all of the solid South except those 3. The counts in those 3 states were very conflicted, very troublesome, and likely very corrupt, or the result of violence at the polls. When you added up the Electoral College that night, or the following day, Tilden had a lead of, you should write this down, I should have put it on the screen, 184 to 166 in the Electoral College. Hayes, by the way, won all of the North, with a couple exceptions. But when they added them all up, it was 184 to 166. It took 185 to win. So the Hayes advisors said, wait a second. If we can win those 3 disputed states, we win 185, 184. Hold the presses. And what ensued now was one of our disputed elections in American history. There's no question violence affected the polls in South Carolina. A lot of black people were kept from the polls by violence, some of them killed. It's probably true that Hayes won South Carolina, and probably true, we don't know for sure, we never will, that Tilden won Louisiana and Florida, but not in the official count. What happens when no one has a majority? Well, they actually followed the Constitution, believe it or not. They threw it over to Congress. And what did Congress do? It established a commission, an electoral commission, which had a slight majority of Republicans on it, because Republicans had gained back control of the House of Representatives. Oh, God. If you look this up online, the official popular vote count was Tilden, 4,284,000, to Hayes, 4,036,000 popular vote. But when the Electoral Commission of 15 members, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 Supreme Court justices, and it came down to a Supreme Court justice named Bradley, whose politics were not altogether clear. And he enjoyed it. When you know you're Joe Manchin. Anybody remember Joe Manchin? When you know you're Joe Manchin, you love that attention you're getting. Everybody wants to I'm not sure just yet. I see wisdom on both sides. I'm not sure about that count in Florida. This commission was supposed to bring in the voting returns and count the bloody things. They couldn't really fully count them, but they had to render a decision. They investigated the 3 disputed states. The Democrats began to they launched a filibuster. It said, if Tilden isn't made president, we're never going to stop the filibuster. Furthermore, militia started to drill in the Upper South and threatened to march on Washington. Now, whether these Southern militias or Southern governors would have put their money where their mouth was, or their troops where their mouth was, in 76 is an open question. President Grant, though, in his last moments in office, began to rebuild the fortifications around Washington. So members of both parties, there's an old story about this that goes something like this. The Democrats stole the election first, and then the Republicans just stole it back. The commission finally rendered its decision, and they said that by an 8-7 vote, Bradley decided to go with Hayes. Hayes would be president because he did indeed win all 3 of the disputed states, 185, 184. The Democrats obviously are outraged, but people had already been working on this. They called a meeting at the Wormley Hotel, and at the Wormley in Washington, they'll still show you the room where this smoke-filled room where this meeting had occurred. On February 26 and 27, representatives of the Republicans and the Democrats met in a smoke-filled room at the Wormley Hotel, and they crafted what has always become known as the Compromise of 1877. Now, some scholars, all the way back to C. Van Woodward, have argued that this was done in the spirit of American compromise. And compromise can be ugly, messy, even a little corrupt. There were a lot of Ohio Republicans in that room. James Garfield was kind of the manager of the whole thing. They cut a deal. They said first, the Republicans said, okay, you can have home rule in Louisiana and South Carolina. We'll help you elect Democratic governors. That's fine. That's probably where this is going anyway. Secondly, they removed the remaining small number. This is always the headline of the Compromise of 1877. And I've said this all my life. It's ridiculous. There were only about 1,000 federal troops left anywhere in the South, and they were all in garrison forts at the coast. So all the internal violence in the South were untouched by federal troops. Republicans agreed to remove the remaining federal troops. A big symbolic issue. Third, there was a promise made here of a major federal subsidy. This is what people really cared about, for a Western Pacific Railroad with a southern terminus. New Orleans, maybe Memphis. A southern transcontinental railroad. That's like, I don't know what it would be today. It would be like saying, we will create you a Silicon Valley. Fourth, 1 or 2 cabinet positions in Hayes's cabinet were promised for Democrats, especially the Postmaster General. That will not be fulfilled, but it was a good promise because the Postmaster General's got a lot of power. The Dems agree to enforce the Civil War amendments. Yes, we'll enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. There had to be Republicans in that room just sort of laughing to themselves, but okay, a deal's a deal. They will enforce black civil rights and the right to vote. And then the Dems agreed to help make James Garfield Speaker of the House from Ohio. And then the Dems agreed to stop their filibuster, except the count, as it was called, of the commission and Hayes would be peacefully inaugurated indoors. They didn't want any trouble. This inauguration was held in what we used to call the East Room. And they didn't have any gold in it in those days. Even in the Gilded Age, it wasn't gold lilted. So on March 3, Rutherford B. Hayes was privately inaugurated at the White House. Catastrophe had been averted, but at what cost? No one knew yet. It would take time to really know what this deal really meant. Was it more a treaty than a compromise? Probably, but that depends on which part of it you look at and which historian you may read. Hayes now announced that he had a new Southern policy. Let them alone. Leave the South alone. As for black voting rights, there was widespread Northern opinion by this time that the 15th Amendment had perhaps been a big mistake. We don't have polling data on that, but we have behavioral data and voting data. Grant himself, who still has such symbolic sway, had said as much to his own cabinet. The 15th Amendment, he said at his last cabinet meeting, had done the Negro no good. And in April 1877, right after this compromise was all announced, although the details of it were not fully announced, the editor of The Nation magazine, E.L. Godkin, rejoiced in this compromise and announced, quote, "The Negro will now disappear from the field of national politics. Henceforth, the nation as a nation will have nothing more to do with him." Well, that's not true, because black folk aren't going to go and hide at all. And that year, in fact, in only 2 months after that event, the Great Strike of 1877 broke out. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, one of the most violent months of labor disorder and protest and strife this country's ever seen. There will be many more violent labor strikes in the next 30 and 40 years into the 20th century. But that strike really came out of the fact that railroads have been overbuilt and they were losing money. So what do big companies do when they lose money? Some of them sell themselves to John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller was getting crazy rich by just forcing people to join Standard Oil, which meant oil and railroads. Rockefeller was a fascinating character, to say the least. It's always the problem with some of these robber barons. I'll come back to that. Yeah, there he is. There's a cartoon of J.D. Rockefeller, note his gold crown. Around that crown are the towns where he had railroad stations and railroad headquarters. He's standing on a barrel of Standard Oil and he's wearing a king's cape. Rockefeller had a partner in his business named Henry Flagler. There's a college in Florida named for him and a lot of other things. Flagler is said to have had on his desk the motto, "Do unto others as they would do unto you, but do it first." The Great Strike of 77 began in Pennsylvania. It was a Pennsylvania fight, struggle that became national almost overnight. It is rooted in the Panic of 1873, because what do railroads do when they're losing money or going under? They cut wages, and then they keep cutting wages. And between 1873 and 1877, in those 4 years, depending on which railroad you look at, railroad workers, which were hundreds of thousands of people, one of the largest employers in America, maybe the largest, their wages were decreased from 20 to 29% all across the landscape. What workers were trying to gain in these years, they don't quite have unions yet. They're going to have unions in the wake of this strike by the 1880s. Fledgling unions, but unions they bled for. They were looking for control over their conditions of labor as much as they were looking for wages. They were looking to be part of management. And they were a ticking time bomb. The B&O Railroad approved a 10% dividend for its stockholders on the same day that it cut its workers' wages 10%. Not good optics, as they say. The strike began with walkouts in Camden, Maryland, Martinsburg, West Virginia, and then a host of other station centers and cities. Some of the press actually supported the strikers when they really learned the facts about their wages. The strike became, in effect, a kind of community rebellion, or as Richard White calls it in his great synthetic book on this period called For the Republic for Which It Stands, he said it became a kind of a social revolution by people in towns and cities and people in the streets who weren't even railroad workers. Trains were coming into towns now and they were stopped by hundreds of people blocking the tracks. If it was a passenger train, the workers would sometimes usher the train through the crowds and let the passenger trains go, but the freight trains, no. Railroad company heads right away got scared out of their shoes and they started to demand federal troops. Hayes at first is all against using federal troops for this. No, I can't use federal troops in the States. He will later. Company heads called the strikers public enemies and worse. They were faced mostly with local militia. It's not true that federal soldiers crushed this strike. It was mostly local militias, although once in a while those local militias dropped their guns and joined the strikers. They didn't get paid much either, if anything. It was poor people in America trying to say to the powers that be, to the bosses, to the companies, we ain't got enough to live on. And we may have to do whatever we can to stop you. The largest violence occurred in Pittsburgh, where between 10 and 20, depending on who was counting, people were killed and 70 injured in one day of violence. All kinds of rail equipment, engines, cars, switches, crushed, destroyed. At one point, the strikers destroyed 3 miles of the track of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The violence was denounced by American liberals as un-American. Americans don't do this. I'll finish with this. Out of this came something called the Working Men's Party. It actually already existed, which was what we would call more far left and did have probably some real communist in it, but they all got painted as communists. In Chicago, that Working Men's Party tried to stage a complete general strike, all workers in everything. Factories, meatpacking, teenagers, Irish immigrants, on and on and on. That was crushed in terrible violence that killed 30 people and wounded 200 on the streets of Chicago. In San Francisco, the labor unrest and the resistance to the railroads turned into anti-Chinese riots, and Chinese people were killed. Out of all this chaos came eventually a movement for the 8-hour day among unions that will actually get traction finally. In fact, it will lead one railroad president to admit in the wake of the 77 Great Strike that, quote, a reduction in pay to employees may be as expensive to the company as an increase in pay. When your equipment is all destroyed, you can't run a railroad. Now, I'm going to have to leave you here, and I will resume with, hold on one second. What happened to this idea of work in the Gilded Age? And what happened to this thing we call corporations? And I will take that into our consideration of Jim Crow and what happened in the West with a little visit to Mark Twain's famous novel, The Gilded Age. Thanks, you.